Great. Well, it's nice to be back together as a steering committee of the Vermont Climate Council. Welcome, everybody. We have, is it 4 of the 5 or 5 of the 6? Hang on a second. Come on, brain. You can do this. We have all but one of you, I think is the right word. And I've got an agenda here that's also posted online. I think that's what Jane has been posting in the chat as well. Secretary Closer, do you want to say anything to kick us off? Hang on one second, you're still on mute.
2 years, and I still can't figure that out.
Right on.
Do you want me to run through the agenda
or pass it to me? I'm happy to do it.
All right, I'm happy to pass it off, David.
Okay, great. Let's look at what we're about to do. You click on that link in the chat, and I'm happy to share my screen with it just for that purpose as well. We're basically doing 3 things today. One is the finalizing a decision on the technical analysis budget and funding. That's something we started in the council last month, and the council sent it over to you to make a final decision. We'll do that, and we have some visuals there that are helpful. Next, we're going to do a quick look into the public engagement work, and particularly upcoming public forums that are happening. And we're interested to get your feedback on that. And we have a decision there too, because we need to figure out who will be presenting in the name of the council there. And you're a good group to help figure that out. And then our final thing to do before public comment is a proposal from Iris, who I see is here, which is great, on ongoing youth engagement in the council that was thoughtfully put together by her. And she can tell us a little bit more about that and a smooth transition from her departure from the council. So those are the 3 things we wanted to do. We will make space for public comment. If you're joining us today, you're not a member of the steering committee, there is a space for public comment towards the end of our meeting. That's what we wanted to do. Any quick questions, or not so quick questions, but thoughts on our agenda, updates, things you'd like to see different? Jane, I saw you unmuted there.
2 comments. Just wanted to highlight that when we have this conversation around technical analysis funding, just reiterate the invitation that went out to all council members to participate in that, and that we just want to lift up that the counselors are here, and if others, in addition to steering committee members, have comments on the in that space, happy for counselors to weigh in at that time as well. And then just around Iris's proposal, it is posted online now, even though it's not linked in the agenda. Just wanted to highlight that. Thanks,
Jane. That's great. Kristen?
David, I just have something quickly on Iris's proposal as well. It looks like from the agenda that the steering committee is being called on to, it's unclear what decision point the steering committee is being called for, because I think any inclusion of Iris's proposed process in the overall process would be something that the entire committee would have to weigh in on. So I'm just clarifying that that this is something that's proposed like for feedback from the steering committee, as opposed to a specific decision from the steering committee.
Sure, I see Jane has her hand up. Maybe you can help us with that.
I guess, well, the reason I thought this could sit with the steering committee is that the main decision point is around subcommittee composition, which has sat with the steering committee to date around approval and process for subcommittee membership. So my hope is that we can do this as a steering committee today, but as we get to that component on the agenda, we can review it and determine if that feels appropriate. But that's the one component in particular that would need a decision point, is around subcommittee composition. So the steering committee.
Thank you, Jane. That's helpful context.
Great. Other things on the agenda before we dive into it? Anything else, folks? Okay, great. Let's do it then. Okay, so the first piece on this is around the technical analysis funding. And as just a quick memory jog, we did this conversation in the council in March. We had a good conversation. The council was sort of leaning in one direction, but didn't feel confident in that moment to actually make a decision, and said, you know what, let's push this to the steering committee. And the steering committee can be in a place to do that. One counselor expressed some concern about that, but allowed that to move forward. And so you're empowered to make this decision today. Since then, Jane and Marion and I have helped try to put together some material and graphics and sort of visualization that help explain perhaps a little bit better how the different pieces of the puzzle fit together in doing this. And so why don't I turn this over to Jane and or Marion to walk us through where we're at now, and what this means for the decision that you all as a steering committee need to make. So Jane, do you want to share your screen or walk us through sort of what's going on?
Yep. Okay, so this is a different representation of the chart of which you all, as well as the full council, have had the opportunity to look at, that intended to lay out first and foremost the way our remaining budget will be spent, as well as priorities that A&R was currently moving forward related to our pending statutory requirements still remaining of the GWSA. In an effort to frame this up rather than a laundry list of technical analyses, and to put in context around really the areas that we all as a council, as well as the agency, are moving forward with respect to climate action, we thought it would be appropriate to frame out the technical analyses needed to support these different buckets, which we've heard over and over again from you all are the priority areas for work, and then try to lay them out clearly with respect to where the funding has either already been allocated or there are pending funding applications out there. I wanted to state right at the onset of this that this is not meant to be inclusive of all of the technical analyses that were recommended within the climate action plan. We had attempted to do that in the chart the table that was circulated with the council last time. Bronwyn Cook did articulate one that I missed in that space, and we have that now to keep track of going forward. However, this is intended to be illustrative of the areas of work where we have made significant enough progress, either at a subcommittee level or with A&R staff, that there are guidelines and parameters to advance RFPs or contracts. So this is inclusive of where we feel anywhere within sort of sight of being ready to advance contractual work. So I'll just walk through it quickly and then leave it up for conversation that David can help facilitate around how we want to lift up and prioritize, as you all remember, that remaining $100,000 that we have unallocated within the GWSA budget for this coming year. And whether or not that money is available in fiscal year 22 or fiscal year 23 is a little unclear based on timing of RFPs and pending work. But regardless, we would start to advance the RFP in the coming weeks and months in that space, because all of these have had enough progress. So wanted to first highlight the work in the resilience and adaptation space. We have the RFP that is completely developed and ready to go out for the Municipal Vulnerability Index. The only holdup in that has been vetted through a task group, as well as reviewed by the Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee. That task group is cross-cutting across science and data, rural resilience, and just transitions. That RFP is fully drafted. It's with our IT staff within ADS to determine whether there is an ADS review component or any component of that work that can be done in-house versus through the RFP. But that's fully budgeted with the GWSA budget and ready to be posted in the near term. The climate toolkit is another statutory requirement that Marion is leading, and she's working with a cross-cutting task group as well in that space from Rural Resilience, which is firmly tasked with the development of the toolkit, and then working also with Science and Data, and I think it's just Science and Data and Rural Resilience, but Marion can correct me if I'm wrong in the chat. And really, that group has been very active, had public engagement events, reached out to stakeholders, including municipality reps through conservation commissions, planning commissions, select board, had a great event and is really honing in on what that tool will look like. We anticipate largely doing that through staff resources, except because of the way we might put it forward on the website, there might be some costs associated with web development in that space. The greenhouse gas inventory has been pending investigation. You'll all remember, of course, that we completed the carbon budget and the greenhouse gas inventory critique as part of the climate action plan, but there are further needs with respect to supplemental analyses for both life cycle analyses in the energy sector space, as well as better understanding how we supplement the greenhouse gas inventory and or perhaps augment the inventory in the natural and working land sector. So both of those are ready to go. The life cycle analysis had an RFI released. We got 5 excellent responses that inform a drafting of an RFP. And you'll remember, specific in the agricultural space, we didn't need an RFI. The work that was done in advance of the carbon budget gave us enough information and parameters that Ag and Eco developed some significant recommendations in this space for us to put forward an RFP. That has a USCA, US Climate Alliance, Grant Alliance pending, a grant pending. And that I had really hoped we would know for this meeting, but we won't know till Friday of this week. So we're like so close to knowing if we have that funding, but we don't know yet. We have applied for $100,000 and have had back and forth feedback with the Climate Alliance, but no indication of how much funding or any funding it will get for sure until the end of the week. Life cycle analysis currently has no grants out to fund it, but there will be supplemental life cycle analyses done that would advance and be coordinated with any life cycle analysis we would do through the GWSA budget, if the passing of the clean heat standard will have funding in that space too. That's to be determined later. The measuring and tracking progress tool. This group hasn't met since the climate action plan has been passed. There was a clear ask and framework put forward within the climate action plan. And based on that, I developed an RFP in this space. We have upwards of $450,000 allocated in the GWSA budget for this. That is both the scoping and planning of the database, as well as the actual building of it. This should really highlight that some of the most in-depth work in this space really is going to be in the resilience space, around the development of metrics in that space, because many of the things we'll track and look for in the emissions reduction space are things that we already have numbers or are doing. So this will have a heavy focus in the onset of planning in the resilience and adaptation space, as well, I should say, in the equity space, because we'll be thinking about how we fold in social justice as well. So the RFP is developed. That's being held up also by ADS right now. That's a big budget, as well as likely has components that can be developed in-house versus also through a contract. And so hopefully that will be reviewed by ADS in a timely manner, and we'll be able to move forward with it and have it under contract before the end of the fiscal year. Emissions reductions, we have a grant also through the Climate Alliance for transportation analyses. This would have a more refined analysis of advanced clean cars too, and that would complement the work already done for advanced clean trucks, so that we had detailed analyses from NESCOM to roll out with our rulemaking. That was phase 1 of what we pitched to the Climate Alliance, and then a phase 2 of that grant would really look at the policy measures needed to close that gap between what our current practices will get us for emissions reductions and what's required by the GWSA. Again, we've heard already that we were funded for phase 1, but haven't heard how much additional funding we'll get for phase 2, and that's on the same timeline as the agricultural emissions grant for the inventory, and we'll know on Friday of this week. So that's a grant funded one, but no additional funding is allocated from the GWSA budget if we don't get that funding. The pathways analysis and development of a mitigation supply curve. I just want to highlight that because that was in our existing contract with Cadmus and EFG. But there were some components that made it clearer that we needed to amend that contract with Cadmus and EFG to rejigger how the money was being allocated. And as such, we put an additional $7,500 towards that contract to support SEI doing that work rather than Cadmus and EFG. It was a minor grant contract change, and we just did it in order to support that being done, as that was a priority in the first RFP and contract. So that's still moving forward and will be done by, I think the timeline is the end of April. And then finally, the last bucket is really around public engagement. And while we know we could do more, we do have our contract with CBI, and we've been thinking about redirecting the funding that we had with Climate Access and RISE to help support CBI rather than having them support Climate Access and RISE, but having them take a lead role in supporting us in our public engagement work, which we'll speak to as the next agenda item today after we get through the technical analysis. So again, this is not meant to be inclusive of all the technical analyses identified for the climate action plan, but really the ones that are seeing work and movement by either state staff and or subcommittees. And hopefully it helps determine and lift up where the gap is and where we can prioritize putting that remaining $100,000. I'll pause there, and then David, ask that you take over to facilitate the decision-making in that space.
Yeah, you bet.
And answer any questions that people have.
Wonderful. Okay, so why don't we do some clarifying questions on what Jane just presented? Any doubts folks have or something that's not clear? Let's do those, and then let's switch gears into saying, okay, let's make a decision on the funding. So clarifying questions, and yeah, absolutely, counselors weigh in. Sue, go ahead, please.
Just a quick question. Thank you so much, Jane. This is very helpful. When we say something is in the Global Warming Solutions Act budget, that's the budget proposal that I assume right now is that funded within the House and now before the Senate as part of the appropriations, or is this sort of a sidebar ARPA funding?
No, so that's a great question, Sue, and we should speak about this, that this is the application of our existing fiscal year 22 remaining budget that A&R already has, but this is also an anticipated budget for fiscal year 23, which has not passed yet. And these are A&R dollars and A&R budget dollars, not ARPA or federal. This is general fund money that is coming to the agency specifically for technical analyses in our budget to support the GWSA work. But these are A&R dollars. This is somewhat speculative as the fiscal year 23 budget hasn't passed, but this is looking back at fiscal year 22 as well as sort of planning for our anticipated budget for fiscal year 23.
As a follow-up, is it okay, David, just to clarify one other point? So we are talking right now about funding that will extend to July of 2023, July 1st, 2023. Okay. And just because I'm honing in on the public engagement piece, which I understand we'll talk a little bit more about, but I do have to hop off at 12 before you're over. Would the existing, what you currently are budgeted for is some funding for CBI, but not more than that. Is that true?
We have in our budget funds to put forward for a new contract that we will put out to an RFP to support ongoing facilitation services that we expect CBI will bid on, but that will be an open RFP process that will foster the facilitation of council and steering committee meetings as CBI has filled that role in the past, as well as support some component of public engagement into the future. And that is not this money I have here is just an add-on to CBI's current contract, which we were able to do because within scope of their current contract, they had this public engagement role, but not as a leadership role. Now they're assuming a leadership role as Climate Access and RISE are no longer engaged. But we anticipate a new RFP for facilitation and work that services like CBI has filled being posted in the coming months as well. And there's
Thank you.
separate money in our budget for that.
Thank you.
Other questions about what we're seeing here and what Jane's describing? Lauren?
Yeah, just a quick clarifying question for Jane on the first bubble under the inventory. The two recommendations that came out of agriculture and ecosystems and were kind of bucketed with the broader science and data subcommittee recommendations were that we would both look into gross emissions accounting for the agriculture emissions sector, acknowledging that the tools that we use now are kind of they're place-based, located out in the Midwest, and we have different practices here. So wanting to make sure that we're accurately accounting for Vermont-based ag practices. And the second part was looking at the ability of our natural and working lands to store and sequester carbon as part of that larger mitigation, both emissions reductions and sequestration storage. Is that captured as both of those? Because I think there was a grant for both, right, Jane?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And you're right. Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to explain when I went through. There will likely, no matter what, be a supplemental analysis needed that similar to life cycle analysis in the agricultural space. But the RFP and pending contractual work in the agricultural space may lead to augmentation of the actual inventory around gross emissions. We won't know that till we do that work, but yes, that one is inclusive of looking at both the gross, if there are changes needed to the inventory and how we look and measure gross emissions, but also to tools to better understand outside the inventory also.
Thanks.
All right, guys. Any other questions before we sort of test the waters here or make a decision? Okay. So I will note when I look at this, there is one thing that says no funding identified, and that one thing happens to be what a large number of counselors were interested in funding and using that $100,000 when we discussed this back in March. So I'll just note sort of like the obvious there. However, let's open up a space for folks who might want to make a more specific idea about how to use that 100,000, whether it's for that life cycle analysis or something else. Like, where are people's heads right now on this? Is it as simple as, yep, it goes right there, there's no funding, it needs the funding? Or is there something a little more complicated we need to think about right now as we make this decision? Where are people's heads on this? Chris?
Hey, it's something that's essential to this work. So I would say if we don't have the money, we need the funding. We need to put the call out there to say, hey, the funding needs to be found to do this.
So I think the decision, Chris, is that there is this 100,000 that's unallocated right now, and that you would put it to that thing, to the life cycle analysis.
Just, I have no idea. Is that too much? Is that enough? I don't know. That's where I'm stuck. So I'm just saying, I guess, just again, from my kind of rational approach would be what's needed, what's it going to cost, and if we have the money, let's put it towards it. If we need more, if it doesn't take that much, that's good, and if it requires more, we need to say that we need to find that money someplace. So I guess my suggestion would be, characterize what the costs are going to be, to get what it is that we need, assuming that and I don't know to what extent there's agreement that as a council, we know what's needed as part of that analysis. And I'm not being provocative. I literally just maybe cross sector and the council, everybody else is totally understands what needs to be part of that. But I guess, just characterizing the study, determining what the cost is going to be, and then trying to find the funding to do it would just be my recommendation. So, yeah.
I see Jane has been putting in the chat and her hands up now too. I think they've been doing that work you're saying, Chris. Jane, you want to just say a little bit more about it?
Yeah, just briefly, when we did the RFI for the life cycle analysis, we asked for an expected budget and cost from the consultants. It ranged anywhere from, I think it was $75,000 to $250,000. So there was a range of expectations, and Megan, I see, is on the call too with Marion. She can correct me if I'm wrong, but the budget range was lower than 100 and went higher. And based on our understanding of how we frame the questions that we used in the RFI and moved to an RFP, we have suggested approaches on how to stay within scale and scope of the $100,000 if that's deemed to be allocated.
Great. Okay. So let me just circle back to you, Chris, then. Does that seem like the work's been done to feel confident that, there's a match between the need and the funding?
I think so. I mean, I'd like to hear from others if there's disagreement. And I apologize if this is well trodden ground. Honestly, we've talked about so much for so long and so intensively. I'm just not remembering exactly everything that we've discussed. So, so I think so, but unless somebody has a different opinion.
Great. Can I just test before we lose Lauren right now? For steering committee members, is anyone opposed to dedicating these funds, this 100,000 to the life cycle analysis? Is anybody opposed among steering committee members? Just real quick before we lose Lauren. I saw Lauren in your chat saying you're up for it, and that seems like the right move. Okay, so can we just do a quick thumbs up from steering committee members? Like, this is the way you want to do it. Yes, let's put that 100,000 of unallocated funds to the life cycle analysis. Quick thumbs up. I see from Jared, Secretary Closer. I'm not sure if you're in a position to do. Yeah. Okay, great. And I see Secretary Moore. Okay. So I'm seeing everybody on a thumbs up. Thanks. I just started to rush it, but because we're losing folks, I wanted to be very clear what we're agreeing to. Okay. That's great. Is there anything else we need to say about that as a steering committee or council members? Thank you for agreeing to do that. But is there anything else from terms of guidance in the implementation that you'd want to give Jane and Marion and others as they go forth and manage these budgets? Okay, great. Okay. Excellent, folks. Well, thanks. That's really helpful. All right. And obviously, fingers crossed for the Climate Alliance grants. And I'm sure Jane will send around the results of those as soon as they come in. Okay. Well, unless there's another comment on that issue, why don't we just keep moving forward on our agenda? Let me just pause. Any other comments on it? Councilors or steering committee members? Okay, great. Great. Okay, so the next piece that we wanted to work on today is the update on public engagement. And we've done this a couple times. I think we did this in a previous meeting with you all. We definitely did it in the council. And we've talked about this sort of three-pronged approach to public engagement. And I don't know, Jane, if you wanted to do an overview of that as well. But as a reminder of that three-pronged approach, remember, one prong is making the plan more accessible in a variety of ways through language and through making it more like a story map online. So there's that accessibility to the initial climate action plan. The second bucket is around sort of broad-based, wide open public engagement. You might call it more traditional. And that's what we're going to be doing starting next week with a couple of public forums. And then the third bucket, we're talking about what we call partner engagement, which is more focused engagement on communities, particularly identified through the Just Transitions Subcommittee. where we want a particular focus, and we know we need to be thoughtful about how you start and maintain a conversation in a relationship with those communities on these issues. And so working with trusted partners is that third prong, and it's very focused around particularly frontline communities and priorities from the Just Transitions Subcommittee. So those are our three prongs around engagement. Today, we wanted to focus on this middle one, which is around these public forums, and give you a little update of where that's going, and get any feedback you have about the agenda we plan for those public forums. And we have a decision point we're looking for as well in the steering committee, which is who presents. And we have some ideas, but we think you're the right group to talk about that. So let me pause. Jane, is there something else you wanted to do to frame up this conversation, particularly as it relates to the public forums?
Nope, that was great. They are next week, so look forward to diving in and sharing taking a deeper dive there. And I have the agenda for them open, Dave, and happy to share that for you if you'd like.
That's great. And before we share that agenda for next week in the forums, I just want to do a quick pause to say, are there any questions folks have about the other prongs, right? The making the plan more accessible and the partner more sort of deep dive engagement before we go into the public forums? Any questions about those other pieces of the public engagement work? Okay, great. Then let's talk about next week. Jane, you want to share that agenda? Okay. So this is a participant agenda, and we're pulling together a more detailed annotated version, but that's I'd rather just stay on this level in this conversation. And the idea, these are going to be 90-minute webinars, but not a Zoom webinar. It'll be a Zoom meeting, just like this is a Zoom meeting. And in those 90 minutes, we'd like to do the following. Thanks, Jared. A welcome. And in that welcome, we'll probably do some who's in the room kind of, quick Zoom polling. Sort of what kind of role do you play? What kind of stakeholder, we might not use that word, but to try to sort of get a sense who's with us today. And so we'll do a little bit of that and saying what we're trying to do and the intent behind here. And let me just say a word about intent, because one of the things we've wrestled with in public engagement for the council is how much do you focus on what the climate action plan was as it was announced versus how much do you focus on what the ongoing work of the council is in 2022 and beyond. And that's an interesting balance that we're trying to address in these public engagement moments. And these are engagement moments which are really the first really broad-based engagement since the plan has come out, in addition to all the work that the legislature is doing on various issues. So what we're trying to do in the overview presentation is that sort of give a sense of what the climate action plan is and how it was developed, but not dwell excessively on that. Flag some of the things that the legislature has taken up and how the action has moved to the state legislature on a number of issues. And then really focus on what the council is going to be doing this year in 2022 in the work of the council as an ongoing body. So that's a presentation. It's like a half hour, 35-minute presentation that tries to balance those things of the development of the action plan, the content of the plan, how the action moved to the legislature, and the work of the council going forward. Then we're going to
If I might,
go ahead, James.
David, Sorry. I just wanted to let folks know as we get to the decision point as well later, that that presentation's been drafted, and we'll be looking at it with the public engagement task group and thinking about how to finalize it. But that, as we think about who's presenting that, there will be a template to share for the presenter that's already done.
That's great. Yeah. Yep. So that pre-work's been done. And so it, you know, if you raise your hand to present, don't feel like you have to like pull your slides together. Jane and everyone will help with that. Okay, so then what we're going to try to do, instead of doing, because we're not quite sure how many people will come, and we do want to do more intimate conversation, like smaller group conversations. So we're going to break up into smaller groups. We're going to have some instructions for facilitators, some from my team, some from state staff, and others who are willing to help out. And we're going to have 2 guiding questions for those small groups. At least that's the way our agenda is structured right now. And you can see them there on your screen. And Jane, you can even scroll a tiny bit further down probably too. But the guiding questions are kind of broad because we think people will be coming in at very different levels. Some may be really in tune with everything that's happening and ready to dive into ultra specific things, while others are going to be sort of getting their minds around the work of the council and climate action for one of the first times in this webinar. So we have broad questions. What is most motivating about the council's planned work in 2022? And what feedback would you most want to have the council hear as it goes into this work, right? We're guiding those questions toward the ongoing work as opposed to a critique of the climate action plan, because we think that kind of input will be most valuable for the council as it does its work this year. Although I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this in this group. So we'll do that for 20 or 30 minutes, 25 minutes or so. And then my dog is going to start to bark. Jane, can you continue for a sec?
Yeah, thank you. And then the idea would be that we would come back together, not have a report out because of how long that takes, but have one person make a comment around the biggest takeaway from their group conversation, share that across the group, and then David suggested using a Zoom poll to have a final temperature check and next steps. So we're hopeful that through decisive and well-written notes that this could be something that would really help inform the direction for the council over the course of the next few months and then into the future. So look forward to having a conversation with you all. And we did, I'll just say, struggle about at what level the question should be asked. We sort of took charted two different paths, one at this high level, or 2 where we would actually have an opportunity to break up into the buckets of work and have more detailed questions and conversation about the different areas for work in the coming months and year. And we chose that to be more inclusive, stuck at this higher level, but look forward to hearing from all of you if you feel like that's the right direction.
Super, thanks. Okay, Jared, why don't you go ahead if you had a question about this?
Yeah, I actually had an offer, a question, and a possible suggestion. So,
Right.
So quickly on the offer, that would be on that second piece, the overview of Vermont climate action. I would be happy to either contribute to or review those slides. I've been focused on a lot of that actually for the last session that we did in terms of what has been taken up and what hasn't been taken up on the transportation sector recommendations. I would just want to offer that I'd be happy to help look at those slides before they're finalized. And then my question is, do we have a sense, I think this is similar to what Secretary Moore put in the chat, of how many people will be or what our goal is for attendance? And I want to reserve a possible suggestion based on the answer to that.
Based on our other online events, we had roughly 100 people at each one, and I think you had close to that on Friday at the transportation one. So don't expect it to be any different with these events. Our partners have been broadcasting these events, and hopefully David, as Marion put in the chat, CBI has been managing the registration because we chose to use CBI's link, which I can't remember why we did that, honestly. But we can't see how many people are registered easily. Marion can't check that. So we can get that. But I would expect, we chose to do, if you haven't noticed, we chose to do one at lunch and one in the evening, trying to reach different people who could come as part of their job and people who couldn't. We're only doing 2 and think of these as like more in line with our traditional events, probably reaching the usual suspects. And that's okay, because we're also thinking about how we go deeper and cast a wider net with our partner engagement. So yeah. And I'll just say about the slides, Jared, completely appreciate folks reviewing and helping, but I don't think we're going to get into a level of specificity. It's really like pivot quickly into next steps and ongoing work. And so, yeah, that's the approach I took, to keep it really to like 20 minutes of presentation.
So Jared, given that answer on the attendance, and I was just messaging my colleague Cam to see if we had a number, and I'll see by the time he messages back or not. But given that, did you want to offer a suggestion?
Yeah, I'm just thinking back to, and this, reflects a lot of the kind of recommendations from the Just Transitions subcommittee, and thinking back to, I think, the feeling that a number of us had from the initial polling in terms of, who was participating and providing feedback, that while we had large numbers, we didn't have a sense of how that feedback was or was not representative of Vermont by geography, by income, racial composition. So my thought would be, if it is going to be a larger group and we can anonymize it, kind of look at aggregate data, not kind of ask individual people to say this, but that in addition to kind of figuring out, how many people are here from a nonprofit or from to represent, I think that would have to be categorized. So it's not, of course, a go around of everybody saying their stakeholder position. I think it could be helpful, again, as long as it's anonymized and at an aggregate level, to get a sense of who is joining by geography, by household income or wealth, and by race. So we can start getting a sense of who are we reaching, who is engaging, and if those things do not match up with the overall demographics of the state, where might we need further attention and focus to get it to be more so.
That's great, Jared. I appreciate that. And just a quick thing, some of the questions we're imagining in the beginning, for instance, what we've done in another meeting is you can annotate a map in real time and people can click where they're from, kind of thing. So you can get a sense of geography really quickly and kind of in an interactive way as well. You can ask absolutely that multiple choice question about sort of, how would you classify yourself, whether civil society, whatever, private sector, government, whatever. So we can make some of that classifications. I think you're right. It's really helpful to have that, and helpful for people to see for themselves too. Jane?
I did just want to flag, you may have noticed this, but if not, I'll draw your attention to when I shared the invite with you all for these events. At the end, there was a comment around the fact that we will not have translation services available for these events, but that we are thinking about how to offer future engagement opportunities in different languages. That said, we have worked through Marion with our contract to translate the blurb that advertises these events in different languages at the request of our public engagement task group, so that some of those folks who want to share it with their networks, who speak English as a second language, can use the blurb in different written form in different languages, which will say, which will be spoken in different languages, but then also say that the event will be in English, but that we hope to engage with them at future events and ask the question of what they need to make this more accessible. We're working on a press release to go out April 7th, and it's 3 days for these events, and hope that the press release will just be that blurb, and then below it have it in different languages below. So we are trying a little bit more proactively to reach more people through this event, even though translation services won't be provided there, as they're really challenging in an online space. If you have only 1 or 2 people who need those services, how to make that inclusive.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Yeah. Other reactions to this, feedback on the structure of these events, how to make them particularly meaningful? Any other thoughts? Okay. So we do face this dilemma of who will be offering that opening presentation. And when we thought about it internally, it sort of made sense to have, in an ideal world, you have a pairing of folks, maybe a counselor who is one of the appointed counselors from the legislature, and then a staff person or an administration person. That kind of pairing would be really lovely if we could pull that off. And I'm wondering if you all have some thoughts about that, and how to make that work. Bram? Wait, hang on, Bram, you're still on mute.
Sorry about that. I think from the public's point of view, the distinction between who's on the council and who's staff is probably less important than having kind of demographic diversity of presenters. I would rather not see 2 old white guys presenting, for instance, my own personal favorite demographic. So I think, mixed gender, mixed age, mixed race is probably more important.
Interesting. Thanks, Bram. How about others? What are we thinking? Chris?
I concur with Bram. At some point, I'd like for us to, and just maybe not a simple request, but be able to kind of translate what are the things that we've already proposed and what are the things that we're moving forward with in 2022. What does that look like at the community and household level, and kind of get feedback on that. So beyond just feedback on our work, feedback on what does this look like in the life of a Vermonter or Vermonters, and just to kind of give people that opportunity, because yeah.
That's interesting, Chris. And I think one of the things we've wrestled with is sort of the detail of what this looks like in the life of Vermonter is very much determined by the way the legislature writes the thing and then the administration writes the rule or whatever, right? So it feels like, how do we do that in a way that feels appropriate from a council standpoint, And I don't have the answer. We've been struggling with it, honestly.
Yeah, I don't either. That's why I'd like to try to pursue it, though, because this is going to have real world, household impacts, and we know that, right? We're changing our relationship to energy and land use and all kinds of other things. So, but I'd like for us to figure out how to have that kind of conversation, because right now it's still tended to be more of a policy conversation, which I get. But it just seems like it'd be good to kind of have, this is, yeah, just try to figure that piece out. And I recognize it's not an easy thing to do. I'm happy to try to think it through. But I would just like to try to engage with more people at that level, so that in parts they even realize the council is thinking in those terms. I mean, I know that if you look at, some of our videos, and so you're not necessarily going to capture it for the minutes, but we bring these kinds of things up. But I think it would might help the broader public, especially it's not really concern, but once the policies actually become actions. I would like for us to try to have some conversation before that happens, because sometimes, I can just tell you from planner world, that's when people finally engage, is once the stuff moves from the policy realm into the actual implementation realm. And I would just like to try to have some discussion and thinking about that now. Maybe that's something we even collaborate with, like, Vermont media on. I don't know, but maybe those are some forums or something like that we can collaborate with. I'm just pulling things out of the air, but like CAX and Vermont Digger and BPR and others, on some, and maybe it's a way for even those groups to kind of collaborate together. But I know it's a big ask. I know it's a big lift. I know we don't have a lot of, we've already got a lot on our plate, but it just feels like it's something important to do, and that we try to figure out how to do it.
Thanks, Chris. I hear that loud and clear for sure. Sue?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And just a point that we are thinking, we, the Just Transitions Committee, but more specifically, a task group within it is working with Marion and Jane to develop, and David, to develop new ways of reaching a broader audience. And I think, Chris, what you just shared is really good, and maybe falls into something we've talked about as storytelling. And the question of using mainstream media to maybe capture some of that. And I like the idea of the perspective of the household and how we connect. So I think let's put a pin on that, because I think it's a great idea. And I think it's something that might grow out of the ideas that we're spawning in our task group. And I have to just say that my question about the money, Jane, was really about, I'm hoping we have enough funding to do creative things like that. And it takes investment and resources. So I don't know how much you have embedded in A&R for this work, but we can get to that at another point. But I did want to say that I think that you're right, Chris, that we need to do this, but this event, as I understand it, which is next week, correct? Is probably going to remain that sort of high-level policy wonk inside the existing bubble and way of thinking, but probably the last one like that for a while, because I think what we will be trying to do is move away from that, precisely because we want to expand connection to what we're doing in very different ways. I'll stop talking. Thanks.
Thanks, Sue. No, that's really helpful. And that's exactly like that third prong that I was trying to talk about when we introduced this, is what Sue's talking about. Jared, then Secretary Moore.
Thanks. I appreciate what has been said. In the interest of time, I want to share briefly some criteria that come to mind, and then put maybe just a suggestion on the table to move us forward. I think a few of the criteria that I'm thinking about are, I think we want to present a diversity of voices in terms of who's speaking on kind of behalf of the council, and not the same folks over and over again. At the same time, I think that the presenters for next Tuesday and Wednesday should be the same, rather than switching between, just to kind of have a clarity to the lineup and flow, and just in terms of preparation. I also agree with the other criteria that's been put forward. I think it's also important that somebody just be comfortable enough with the content to clearly and accessibly present it. I think also, especially if there was a lot of vision put into this from the Just Transition Subcommittee and from staff, it could be particularly helpful to have voices from there to make sure that the kind of presentation is aligning with the vision that was developed. If we also think about folks who are very comfortable presenting at a high level overview of the CAP recommendations and what comes next, I think there are a number of people, from Secretary Moore to Chris to Lauren, who have been presenting in the legislature on this, as well as Jane and myself. But my starting point suggestion is to get something on the table, if that is welcome and helpful at this point, not to volunteer others if they're not willing to be, but I would suggest a pairing of Jane and Sue as a starting point.
Nice. Okay. Secretary Moore.
Sure. I was also going to offer a suggestion that's different than what Jared just put forward. I wonder about having someone from the task group that's really been sort of the engine behind the design of these workshops, introducing the why, and then frankly, David, turning to CBI and asking you to present the overview. I think it would give a consistency between the two different webinars that would be helpful, and just a sort of a consistent framing that I think has real value in how we communicate with the public.
Interesting. Okay. Thanks, Secretary Moore. All right, so there's a few ideas on the table. I wonder what we want to do here. Do folks, when you hear Jared's suggestions, when you hear what Secretary Moore says, where do your minds go? And I'm just going to close the door to my office for 1 second. It's a difficult time of day in my house right now. Just keep going. But where do your minds go around this dilemma of who presents? And if fundamentally you think, you know what, it's going to be okay no matter what we do, that's okay to say too. Hang on just 1 second. All right.
David, I guess part of my thinking and suggesting CBI do sort of the meat of the presentation is obviously each one of us has a bunch of different hats we're wearing when we come to these conversations. And I think it may be challenging for the public to view any member of the Climate Council as presenting on behalf of the council and not immediately associated with the organization from which they hail.
Very interesting. Okay. Jared?
Well, I appreciate what Secretary Moore is saying. I do think that what I'm most comfortable with, and what I think of as a best practice for facilitators, is to be in a facilitation role and not a substantive kind of content presentation. I do think that it's very important that even though everyone on this council wears multiple hats, that we are speaking about the climate action plan and speaking on behalf of the recommendations made, that kind of we're standing behind this. So, it could be another pairing. It could be Secretary Moore and Chris. I'm less concerned about the pairing, but I do think when we get into the substance and content, it should be counselors presenting that. And I think that both for the sake of clarity and to not put our facilitators in an awkward position, I don't think they should be in a position of presenting on content or substance of the plan. That should be our job.
Okay. Are there other views out there on this issue? Steering committee members?
I guess I do share Julie's concern about, or maybe it wasn't, it's probably Julie's statement, so I shouldn't phrase it as a concern, but of having Jane or Julie, someone from A&R speaking about, presenting this on behalf of the council. I feel like it will seem as if it is an A&R presentation, and I don't think that's the purpose or goal. I like the idea of the outreach committee. I think that gives it some consistency, to be totally upfront. I'm not exactly, it's always uncomfortable to nominate people who aren't here to protest, but it does seem like that's, the part of the mission and point of that committee and would provide some consistency in presentations moving forward. So I like the idea of the either the committee or a spokesperson from the committee, et cetera. My thoughts.
So we're at time here because I want to make sure we leave time for the youth proposal. So I'm hearing some different views on this. On the one hand, we're trying to solve the puzzle of this not being perceived as any one organization's, for instance, ANR's or somebody else's organization's plan, right? It's really the council's plan. So we want that to happen. At the same time, we want counselors in the council to really own the content of that plan. And it's a little awkward because it's like, I'm sort of in the mix of this now. But that's something I'm hearing. And we'd like to have some consistency on the two sessions, one in the late afternoon, one in the midday. And so we need people who are available for both. That sounds like a little bit of a puzzle. And I think with those key ideas in play, like we don't want this to be perceived as any one organization's or any one agency's plan. And yet we want counselors to be fully owning this thing. If we're able to take that puzzle with Jane and try to work to find people's availability and who's able to do it, I think that would be my suggestion of how to move forward. Chris?
Yeah, I appreciate that we're having this conversation. It'd almost be handy to have a slide that not only has the whole list of everybody on the council, but then also all the subcommittee members. Even the subcommittee members aren't necessarily, making the final decisions, just to show the full cast of who all has been engaging in this.
Right.
And then this would be, I know this is more work, so I'm hesitant to even suggest it, but it just popped into my head. If there was a way that we had, like a bio photo of everybody, and then like, in addition to the names on the screen, just, had like an image of all the photos of everybody who's been participating in the development of the plan kind of pulled together. Because that way, I just think if we can communicate that this is a plan being pulled together by Vermonters for Vermonters, that might help whoever's presenting this, and just to kind of have that for whenever we're presenting on this, whenever we're presenting to the public. Again, not trying to create a lot of work for anybody, but just thought that beyond names, actually literally having the faces might help.
Thanks, Chris. That's a nice suggestion. Okay, so are you as a steering committee comfortable with Jane and myself and others moving forward, trying to find this right mix of folks, trying to balance these two things we're hearing, which are about not any one organization being perceived as owning this thing, whether it's ANR or some other organization, and at the same time, counselors really owning content of the plan. Are folks okay with us moving forward and trying to solve that puzzle over the next few days and getting people's availability and the like? Any concerns with us going forward in that way? No? Okay. So why don't we go forward in that way, and knowing we actually didn't resolve it with some people's names right now, but we do have some key thoughts there on the table about how to do that. Okay. Anything else on this before we go to the youth engagement piece? And obviously we're very eager to have you all and everybody participating in these events next week too, right? We think that would be positive to have a pretty broad participation from counselors and subcommittee members. So we'll be encouraging that through emails. Okay. So let's turn to this proposal for youth engagement. And Iris, hi, it's good to see you. I won't try to frame this up more than just saying, I understand that you put together this thoughtful proposal in part because you need to make a transition off the council and you're interested in seeing youth voices very much part of this story going forward. So that's the only frame I was going to put on this. And I don't know, Iris, if you want to just pick it up from there and say a little bit more about what this is. So maybe I'll just turn it over to you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that was a good framing. I mean, I'm looking towards my transition off the council, though I'm still going to be here to support whoever the next youth member is. So I think that's an important part of this. And this is just sort of a proposal trying to put in place more supports for that youth member, because it's a lot of work, and a lot of this work is during school hours, and a lot of this work is things with where there are rooms with people who all have like many more degrees than I have had, so trying to put in place some supports there, so I'm not throwing some other young person into the deep end in this process. Yeah, I'm happy to entertain any questions or thoughts on it. It's the basic part of it is just creating a youth advisory council, so that there are more members to help support the work of youth engagement, and they can sort of collaborate on this and have this be a team of young people who are doing it rather than just one, and then utilizing the Vermont Energy Education Program's resources to support and help facilitate that, and just provide support in ways that the young people need to be determined. Yeah.
That's great, Iris. So yeah, so when you look at the proposal, yeah, the key pieces of this are trying to get more voices involved, younger voices involved, supporting those voices through sort of a group and using Vermont Energy Education Program to help support those voices, explicitly having younger voices in all of the subcommittees, which hasn't really been the case to date, right? And then obviously having your replacement on the council as well. That's how I read the proposal. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, you got it.
Cool, great. Okay, so as Jane says, and I think Secretary Clouser mentioned, so what are we deciding on here? And are we the right people to decide as a steering committee? Should this go to the full council? I wonder if it's a both and, in the sense of, if there's questions about subcommittee membership, we can get going on that right away. And this steering committee is in a place to do that. You may, as a steering committee, decide, you know what, let's get going on the whole thing right away, and we'll tell the council about it next meeting. So I'm curious, steering committee members, first your reactions to this, and then we'll figure out what we need to decide about it. Jane, you want to say something else?
I did just want to speak to its timeliness. Iris was gracious enough to bring this forward as we're also considering new subcommittee members for 3 committees that have gaps right now, and it's easy enough, and have already updated the survey nomination form to think about how we would expand the nomination form to be clear about a youth nomination and have all 5 subcommittees represented there. So it feels like that discrete component of the proposal, at the very least, it'd be great and timely to keep that moving forward, as Just Transitions, Rural Resilience, and Science and Data are considering new members right now, which we intend, we had hoped would be ready to bring forward to you all today, but it's still under deliberation by those subcommittees and would come forward to the next steering committee meeting with that new composition of subcommittees for you all to approve, as you have traditionally. And then just one thing I'll flag that isn't in this proposal, but Iris, that we talked about with you, is I think a really exciting opportunity that Mariah from BEEP suggested in the future, is hoping to collaborate where BEEP has been able to successfully secure credits for college students through life experience and learning, so that the hope would be that in addition to being a full member of the subcommittee and getting stipends for that, there would also be the potential and leverage for those students to get credit for joining onto subcommittees and or the council to support that ongoing work, which we think would be a really nice support network for them.
Reactions, thoughts?
So I just have a clarifying question, Jane, to the point you just made. Would that be a stipend and credit, or would it be an and/or situation if they were receiving credit? Sorry,
As I said it, I
down
was
in the
like,
weeds, I'm just. curious.
As I said it, I was like, I'm sure there's some state rule or policy I would have to consider whether they could have, and so I guess we'd have to explore that and make sure there was no conflict.
Okay, so it's open question.
Yes.
I love the proposal. The only one question I have, and I just think, I'm trying to remember what open meeting law says. Iris, I know why it would be preferable to not have it be a public meeting, because that can make conversations more difficult to have. But I don't know if that's allowed, but that's a little question that we can figure out. But just want to recognize, I totally get why that would be proposed. I'm trying to remember what open meeting law says about any like specifically defined subgroup of said appointed, said statutorily defined or enabled group. It's probably gonna be fine, but I think that's just a question we'll just have to figure out.
Right. Yeah, let's make sure we check the boxes on that so we don't run into trouble. Again, if it's not a quorum of any of the individual groups, or or not more than 2 members of any individual groups, you should be fine. But definitely let's make sure we're not running into trouble. Okay. Great. Other reactions to this? Great. And I'm just assuming, I haven't seen it, but are people feeling enthusiastic about this in the way that Chris and, is this something that's, yeah, great. Good. I just want to register that like enthusiasm is here. Is there any concern with you all saying, let's go ahead and at the least start with the subcommittee piece of this, because that involves the composition and what Jane explained about how this is really relevant for this moment where several subcommittees are looking to expand membership. Is there any concerns about you all saying, go for it?
My only question is, did we do enough to solicit youth interest to actually be able to affect that change on the timeline we sort of put ourselves on for the other subcommittee nominations?
So to date, Iris was gracious enough to nominate a number of folks, but we did discuss with Iris that we would love to cast a broader net to get more nominations. And so we were sort of waiting on you all to discuss this and would do that to ensure others have an opportunity to step forward and nominate themselves or others to serve.
Great. Okay. And Jane, what is the timing on these nominations? Is it sort of fluid, or is there a drop deadline somewhere in there?
We had a drop deadline. We've cruised past that. And the nomination form is still open, and all of the individual subcommittees are meeting in smaller groups ahead of their next meetings, which are in April. So we can work to send this out and have another 1 to 2 week nomination period and see how far we get, and hope that by the end of April we can close up the conversation. But if not, I think it can be a bit fluid.
Right. Chris?
Iris, maybe, I'm not trying to just put this on you, but thought you might know. Is there any kind of like statewide youth climate network or school network of school climate groups or anything like that through which word can be gotten out?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a part of the Vermont Youth Lobby, which is sort of somewhat like that, or what you're talking about. And then also the Vermont Energy Education Program works with teachers and students across the state. And then the plan would also be, we have lists of principals. So maybe we would possibly, after we hopefully get approval, we'll send that out to the principals so that they can put that out to their students as well.
Great. So, so I guess the way to end this would be to say, what you as a steering committee are doing today is you're expressing support for the overall initiative. You're giving a green light to go ahead on the subcommittee aspects of this. You have some follow-up questions, and you'd like to see this go before the council as well, so the full council can weigh in and say, this is great, let's do it. Are those the 3 things you're doing today? Does that seem right, steering committee members? Okay. Expressing support, saying go ahead with the subcommittee aspects of this because that are timely, and then bringing this to the full council. And also you put a few questions out there that need some answers around, the public meeting stuff and the stipend and the credit stuff, right? Okay. Any concerns with those three? Should we treat those as your three, decisions on this? Okay, great. Wonderful. And thank you, Iris, for putting it together, explaining it and being here today to do that with us in the steering committee. That's great. Okay, so let's do some public comment of folks who are here today that have been listening in to the conversation, who might want to weigh in on what we've been talking about. If anybody's here today, feel free to raise your hand. We're a pretty small group, so just open up your mic as well. Okay. Great. I'm not seeing interest in that. That's the last thing we had in our agenda here. So let me do a quick check. Are there any pending things before we sign off today? Any last things that we need to deal with? Okay. Great, folks. Okay. Wonderful. Thanks so much. Jane and I and you all have some work to do in the next 48 hours to figure out who's going to be presenting next week. We will take this conversation we had today and try to artfully find the right pairings or combinations of folks. Stay tuned on that, and there'll be some individual conversations. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye,
Your
everyone.
dog is better behaved than mine, Chris. Take care.
Good thing we're talking about public engagement in 10 minutes, David.
Yes, exactly.
I'll see you in a minute.
Yeah.
Bye.
Take care.